Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. When you've lost the love of your life, even breathing feels like too much effort, let alone caring for anyone else. Boone Calder knew that pain well. The old mountain trapper had been living alone in the Colorado wilderness for 3 long years, ever since his beloved Martha passed. He kept to himself, spoke to no one, and trusted even less. But when a fierce blizzard brought 2 freezing dogs to his cabin door, something deep inside him couldn't just walk away. He fed them his precious food and wrapped them in his late wife's quilt. The next morning, Boone woke up to find the entire village surrounding his cabin. Those weren't just stray dogs. They belonged to a missing search party, and now the whole town wanted answers. What secret would this act of mercy reveal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been howling for 3 days straight when Boone first spotted them through the frost-covered window of his cabin. 2 dark shapes against the white expanse, moving with the desperate slowness of creatures fighting death itself. He'd watched them through his old brass spyglass, the one Martha had given him for their 10th wedding anniversary. As they stumbled closer to his property line, Boone Calder had built his life in these mountains deliberately, choosing isolation over the well-meaning sympathy of Pine Ridge's townsfolk. His cabin sat a good 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, perched on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. From his front porch, he could see the thin ribbon of smoke that marked the town's location. But it might as well have been a world away. The leather-bound journal on his kitchen table told the story of 3 years in careful, measured handwriting. Daily observations about weather patterns, animal migrations, and trap yields. But between the practical entries, anyone who cared to read would find the real story. The gradual withdrawal of a man who'd lost his anchor to the world. March 15th found deer tracks near the South Ridge. Martha would have liked the way the morning light caught the snow. June 3rd repaired the porch step she always said squeaked. No one to complain about the noise now. The entries had grown shorter as the seasons passed, more focused on survival than reflection. But the journal remained, a testament to habits Martha had encouraged, routines that kept him tethered to something resembling normalcy. Pine Ridge had been their town together. Martha had run the schoolhouse for nearly 20 years, teaching 3 generations of mountain children their letters and numbers. She'd known every family, every story, every secret the valley held. When pneumonia took her during the brutal winter of '89, the town had tried to embrace Boone in his grief. Mayor Hawkins had stopped by weekly for months, bringing news and invitations to church socials. Doc Morrison had prescribed work and company as medicine for a broken heart, but Boone had felt their pity like a weight on his shoulders. The careful way they spoke around him, the nervous glances when someone mentioned their own spouse, the awkward silences when he appeared in Sarah Chen's general store for supplies. He'd been half of something whole for so long that standing alone felt unnatural, like walking with one leg shorter than the other. Sarah Chen understood better than most. She'd lost her own husband to a mining accident 5 years earlier, left to raise 2 young children while keeping the store afloat. She'd been the one to suggest Boone might find peace in the mountains, away from the constant reminders of what he'd lost. She'd helped him select supplies for his self-imposed exile, never once suggesting he was making a mistake. Grief's got its own timeline, she'd told him, counting out coins for his coffee and tobacco. Some folks need to be around people when it hits. Others need the quiet to hear themselves think. Just remember, Boone, thinking and hiding aren't the same thing. That had been 3 years ago. Since then, his contact with Pine Ridge had dwindled to quarterly supply runs, brief exchanges of necessities and news. He'd become a story the townspeople told, the hermit who'd loved his wife so much he couldn't bear to live without her memory in peace. The mountains had been good to him in their harsh way. His traplines provided enough pelts to trade for supplies. The garden Martha had taught him to tend still produced vegetables through the short growing season. He'd learned to smoke meat, preserve fruits, and stretch every resource through the long winters. Solitude had sharpened his awareness. He could read weather patterns in the way the wind shifted, predict animal behavior by studying tracks in the snow. But the mountains also taught harder lessons. 2 weeks ago, Pine Ridge had organized a search party for 3 missing travelers, a small group that had been heading through the mountain passes to reach family in Denver before winter set in completely. Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley had volunteered to lead the search, along with young Jake Morrison, Doc's nephew, and an experienced hunter named Caleb Wright Boone. Had heard about the search party through the peculiar mountain telegraph of distant gunshots and smoke signals. The standard protocol was 3 shots fired in succession, repeated at intervals, to help lost travelers orient themselves towards safety. But after the first few days, the signals had stopped. Pine Ridge had sent out a second search party, but they'd found no trace of the missing men. The town was on edge. Winter was closing in with unusual severity, and losing 3 experienced outdoorsmen suggested something more dangerous than simple navigation errors. Some folks whispered about bear attacks, others about avalanches in the high passes. A few mentioned the stories old-timers told about strange things that happened in the deep mountains when winter storms lasted too long. Boone had noted the silence in his journal. November 8th, no signals from search party for 3 days. Weather turning worse. Check trap lines early in case I need to stay close to cabin. He'd increased his wood cutting, secured extra provisions, and prepared for the kind of storm that could last weeks. He hadn't expected visitors. The 2 dogs had appeared on his property like ghosts materialized from the blizzard. Border collies, from what he could see through the spyglass, good mountain dogs, bred for intelligence and endurance. But they moved with the stumbling gait of animals at the end of their strength. Their fur was matted with ice, and even from a distance he could see the gaunt lines of starvation beneath their coats. Any sensible man would have watched them pass. Food was precious in winter, and taking in strays was a luxury he couldn't afford. The practical voice in his head, the one that had kept him alive through 3 harsh winters alone, urged him to stay inside. Let nature take its course, but something in their movement reminded him of another winter. Years ago, when Martha had found a half-frozen barn cat outside their home in town. She'd brought it inside despite his protests about veterinary bills and extra mouths to feed. "Sometimes," she'd said, warming milk on the stove while the cat shivered in a basket by the fire, "being alive means more than just surviving." The cat had lived with them for 8 years, becoming a fixture in Martha's classroom and a comfort during her final illness. It had died the spring after Martha passed, as if unwilling to face another season without her gentle hands. Standing at his window, watching 2 desperate animals fight their way through the snow toward his cabin, Boone felt that old ache in his chest, the hollow space where Martha's voice used to guide his better instincts. She would have already been outside with blankets and warm milk. She would have scolded him for hesitating while creatures suffered within his power to help. The wind gusted harder, driving snow against the windows with a sound like thrown sand. The temperature was dropping as the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks, and the dogs were still a quarter mile from his door. They wouldn't survive the night in the open. Boone pulled on his heaviest coat and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and numbing his exposed skin within seconds. He could barely see the dogs through the swirling snow, but he followed their tracks, moving carefully across ground that could hide rocks, roots, or sudden drops beneath the white blanket. He found them huddled against a fallen log, pressed together for warmth that their depleted bodies could barely provide. Up close, he could see they were in worse condition than he'd thought. Their ribs showed clearly through their matted fur, and their eyes held the dull glaze of animals conserving their last reserves of energy. "Easy now," he said, his voice strange after days of silence. "Easy. The dogs didn't run." That told him everything about their condition. Healthy animals would have bolted from a stranger's approach. Instead, they watched him with the weary resignation of creatures who'd already accepted their fate. Boone knelt in the snow, moving slowly to avoid startling them. "Come on then. Let's get you somewhere warm." It took him 20 minutes to coax them to their feet and guide them back to the cabin. The larger dog, a black and white male with intelligent eyes, managed to walk on his own, though he stumbled frequently. The smaller one, a female with brown markings, had to be carried the last 100 yards. She felt frighteningly light in his arms, all bones and loose skin beneath her coat. Inside the cabin, Boone settled them near the fireplace, building up the fire until heat radiated into every corner of the room. He checked them carefully for injuries, finding only the expected damage of exposure and starvation, cracked paw pads, minor frostbite on their ears, and the general weakness that came from days without adequate food. They needed warmth before food, and food before water. Boone heated milk in a saucepan, adding a little honey for energy, and offered it to them in shallow bowls. They drank carefully, their stomachs too shrunken to handle large quantities at once. While they rested, he prepared a meal of cooked rabbit and vegetables, food he could barely spare but felt compelled to share. The dogs ate with the focused intensity of starving animals, though they stopped when their bellies had reached capacity, showing the intelligence of breeds that knew to pace themselves when food was uncertain. As the evening deepened, Boone found himself watching them with something approaching contentment. The cabin felt different, with living creatures sharing the space. Warmer somehow, though the fire burned no brighter than usual. Their presence reminded him of sounds he'd forgotten, the soft breathing of sleep, the gentle movement of settling bodies, the quiet companionship of shared shelter. When it came time to sleep, he faced a decision that surprised him with its difficulty. The dogs had claimed a spot near the hearth, curled together on the rough wooden floor. They needed better insulation against the cold that would seep through the walls during the night. But Boone's blankets were few and precious. His gaze settled on the chest in the corner, Martha's hope chest, still containing the quilt she'd made during their early years of marriage. He'd avoided opening it since her death, unable to bear the sight of her careful stitches and the lavender sachets she'd tucked between the folds. But tonight, with two dying animals sharing his hearth, the choice seemed obvious. He lifted the lid and withdrew the quilt Martha had finished just before their last winter together, a pattern of interlocking rings in blue and white. Every stitch placed with the patience and love that had defined their life together. The quilt smelled of lavender and memory. Boone spread it carefully over the sleeping dogs, tucking the edges around their thin bodies. The larger dog opened his eyes briefly, acknowledging the kindness with a gentle thump of his tail against the floor. "Sleep warm," Boone whispered, words Martha had said to him countless times during their years together. He banked the fire and settled into his own bed, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet breathing of his unexpected guests. For the first time in 3 years, the cabin didn't feel empty. Morning would bring complications he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, warmed by an act of mercy that felt like a gift to Martha's memory, Boone Calder slept more peacefully than he had since the day he'd laid his wife to rest. Boone woke to the sound of voices, human voices where no human should be. For a moment, caught between sleep and waking, he thought he was dreaming of the old days when Martha would invite the neighbor women for quilting circles. But the voices were deeper, rougher, and carried the sharp edge of winter air. He sat up in bed, immediately alert in the way mountain living had taught him. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind the peculiar silence that follows heavy snowfall. But this silence was broken by the murmur of many people, their words indistinct but their presence unmistakable. The dogs heard it too. Both animals were on their feet by the fireplace, ears pricked and bodies tense. The larger male moved to the window, standing on his hind legs to peer through the frost-covered glass. A low whine escaped his throat, not fear, but recognition. Boone pulled on his boots and heavy coat, his mind racing through possibilities. Nobody came to his cabin uninvited. The trail was treacherous even in good weather, and after last night's storm, it would be nearly impassable. Yet the voices continued, growing louder as more people seemed to join whatever gathering had formed outside his door. He opened the cabin door and stepped onto his covered porch, squinting against the brilliant glare of sunlight on fresh snow. What he saw stopped him cold. At least 30 people stood in his yard, their dark figures stark against the white landscape. He recognized most of them, despite the years of separation. Mayor Hawkins, with his distinctive grey beard, Doc Morrison carrying his worn medical bag, Sarah Chen wrapped in the colorful wool coat she'd imported from San Francisco. But there were others too, shopkeepers, ranch hands, even old Mrs. Patterson, who rarely left her boarding house during winter months. They stood in a loose semicircle, faces turned toward his cabin with expressions he couldn't immediately read. Some held rifles, not pointed at him but ready. Others carried coils of rope, canvas stretchers, the tools of men prepared for grim work. Boone Calder. Mayor Hawkins stepped forward, his breath forming white clouds in the cold air. "We need to talk." Behind Boone, the dogs pressed against his legs, their bodies trembling, not from cold, but from what seemed like excitement mixed with anxiety. The larger male pushed past him onto the porch, tail wagging frantically as he looked toward the crowd. Doc Morrison's eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned. That's Banner, Tom Bradley's dog." The name hit Boone like a physical blow. Tom Bradley, the deputy marshal who'd led the missing search party. He looked down at the dog pressed against his leg, Banner, and felt the pieces of a puzzle he didn't understand clicking into place. "And that's Sage," called out Jake Morrison, Doc's nephew, pointing to the smaller female still standing in the doorway. "She belongs to Caleb Wright." The crowd shifted, a ripple of tension passing through the assembled townspeople. Boone felt their eyes on him with new intensity, saw the way hands moved closer to rifle stocks and rope coils. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd, her face flushed from the cold ride up the mountain. "Boone, where did you find them? Are they hurt? Do you know—" "Now hold on," Mayor Hawkins interrupted, raising his hand for silence. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." His eyes never left Boone's face. "We've been searching for 3 missing men for 2 weeks. Tom Bradley, Jake Morrison, and Caleb Wright. Last seen heading into the high country with their dogs before the weather turned." Boone felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the cold air. "I found them last night," he said carefully. "During the storm. They were half frozen, near death." "The dogs," Doc Morrison clarified, moving closer. "But what about the men?" "I don't know anything about the men." Boone's voice carried the honesty of a man who'd lived alone too long to master deception. "These 2 showed up on my property around sunset. I brought them inside, fed them, warmed them up. That's all I know." The crowd stirred uneasily. Boone could see the calculation in their faces. A hermit who'd isolated himself from their community, found alone with the dogs of missing men. In any other circumstance, the explanation would be simple. The dogs had survived whatever killed their masters and found the nearest shelter, but something in their manner suggested otherwise. "Banner," Doc Morrison called softly, extending his hand toward the larger dog. "Come here, boy." The dog looked between Doc Morrison and Boone, clearly torn. He whined again, a sound that spoke of confusion and loyalty divided. Instead of going to the doctor, he moved back to Boone's side, pressing against his leg with obvious affection. "That's peculiar," Doc Morrison murmured. "Banner's always been Tom's shadow. Wouldn't leave his side for anything." Sarah Chen stepped closer, her expression more concerned than suspicious. "Boone, may I examine them?" "They look thin," he nodded, grateful for her practical approach. Sarah had always been the voice of reason in Pine Ridge, the one person who seemed to understand that sometimes circumstances were exactly what they appeared to be. She knelt beside Banner, running her hands over his coat with the efficiency of someone who'd grown up around working animals. Her fingers found something almost immediately, a small object tangled in the thick fur around his neck. "What's this?" She worked carefully, trying not to hurt the dog, as she freed whatever was caught in his coat. When she held it up, the morning sunlight caught the metal and threw it back in sharp points of light. A badge, tarnished silver with the distinctive star of a deputy marshal. The same badge Tom Bradley had worn with pride for 8 years. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the wind whistling through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. Every eye was fixed on that small piece of metal, and Boone felt the shift in the crowd's mood, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. "Tom's badge," Mayor Hawkins said quietly. "Frozen right into the dog's collar." Boone stared at the badge, his mind struggling to process what it meant. If the badge was frozen into Banner's fur, the dog had been wearing it for days, possibly since the search party had gone missing. But how had it gotten there? And where was Tom Bradley? Boone Calder. Mayor Hawkins' voice carried the formal tone of official business. "I think you'd better explain exactly what happened here." "I told you what happened," Boone replied, but he could hear the defensive edge creeping into his voice. "I found the dogs freezing in the snow. I brought them inside. I don't know anything about Tom Bradley or his badge." "Dogs don't just lose their masters and wander around wearing their badges," called out someone from the back of the crowd. "Not unless something happened to make them take it, or unless someone put it there," added another voice. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Boone felt the accusation without anyone having to voice it directly, that he might have harmed the missing men and kept their dogs, that the badge was evidence of something darker than a simple rescue. "Now just a minute," Sarah Chen stood up, her voice sharp with anger. "You're all letting your imaginations run wild. Boone Calder isn't capable of hurting anyone. He's lived up here alone for 3 years, bothering nobody." "Maybe that's the problem," Mayor Hawkins said grimly. "Man lives alone that long, sometimes he gets ideas. Sometimes he doesn't want visitors disturbing his peace." Doc Morrison was examining Sage now, his weathered hands gentle as he checked her condition. "She's got something too," he announced. "Piece of cloth, looks like. Frozen into her tail." He freed a small scrap of blue fabric, the same blue wool that comprised Caleb Wright's winter coat. More evidence that the dogs had been with the missing men, and recently enough for the items to still be tangled in their fur. Boone felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes, all calculating the same dark possibilities. Here was a man who'd withdrawn from society, living alone in the mountains, with access to countless places where bodies could disappear forever. Here were the dogs of missing men, carrying evidence of their masters, but no sign of the men themselves. "I think," Mayor Hawkins said slowly, "we need to search this property. Top to bottom, you can't just—" Boone began, but Sarah Chen interrupted him. "Yes, they can. And you should let them." Her voice was firm but kind. "Let them search, Boone. Show them you've got nothing to hide. It's the only way to clear the air." Boone looked at the faces surrounding him, some suspicious, some uncertain, all of them cold and tired from the hard ride up the mountain in dangerous conditions. These weren't strangers come to persecute him. These were his neighbors, people who'd known him and Martha for decades, now faced with a mystery that seemed to point in only one direction. "All right," he said quietly. "Search what you want. But I'm telling you the truth. I don't know what happened to those men. The dogs showed up last night and I took them in." "That's all?" Mayor Hawkins nodded grimly. "We'll see about that. Doc, you and Jake take the barn and outbuildings. Sarah, check inside the cabin if Boone agrees. Rest of you spread out and look for any sign of the missing party. And folks, be thorough. 3 good men are missing, and we owe their families answers." As the crowd dispersed to begin their search, Boone stood on his porch with the 2 dogs pressed against his legs, wondering how an act of mercy had transformed overnight into evidence of guilt. The badge felt heavy in his pocket where Mayor Hawkins had placed it, a piece of metal that connected him to a mystery he didn't understand. But as he watched Banner and Sage, saw the way they looked toward the tree line, with ears pricked and bodies alert, he began to suspect that the dogs knew more than anyone realized. They weren't just survivors of some tragedy. They were witnesses, and somehow they'd led the entire town of Pine Ridge straight to his door. The search took most of the morning, and with each passing hour, Boone felt the weight of suspicion growing heavier. He sat on his porch steps, watching as townspeople he'd known for decades, methodically, examined every corner of his property with the grim efficiency of men looking for graves. Doc Morrison and his nephew Jake had found nothing in the barn except the usual trapping, Supplies, stretching frames, skinning knives, and bundles of pelts waiting for the next trading run to town. The shed yielded only firewood, tools, and the preserved vegetables that would see him through winter. Even the root cellar, dug deep into the hillside behind the cabin, contained nothing more suspicious than sacks of potatoes and jars of pickled beets. Sarah Chen emerged from the cabin, shaking her head. "Nothing unusual inside," she announced to Mayor Hawkins. "Just what you'd expect from a man living alone. Clean, organized, everything in its place." She paused, glancing at Boone with something that might have been sympathy. Found his journal on the kitchen table. Daily entries about weather and trapping. Last entry was yesterday. Mentioned seeing the dogs and bringing them inside. Mayor Hawkins frowned. "Could be covering his tracks. Could be telling the truth," Sarah replied firmly. "The entries go back months, Charles. Regular observations, nothing out of the ordinary. Unless you think Boone's been planning this since summer." While the humans searched, Banner and Sage had grown increasingly agitated. The larger dog paced the length of the porch, whining softly as he watched the tree line. Every few minutes he would look at Boone, with eyes that seemed to hold urgent communication, then return his attention to the forest. "They're trying to tell us something," Boone said quietly. "More to himself than to anyone else." Sarah heard him. "What do you mean?" "Look at them. They're not acting like dogs who've been through trauma and found safety. They're acting like dogs with a job to do." As if responding to his words, Banner suddenly trotted down the porch steps and headed toward the tree line, stopping after 20 yards to look back at the assembled humans. When no one followed, he returned to the porch, circled twice, and repeated the action. "He wants us to follow him," Jake Morrison observed. "I've seen tracking dogs do the same thing." Doc Morrison wiped his hands on his coat and walked over to study the dogs more carefully. "Now that I think about it, they're in better condition than they should be. Half-starved, yes, but not as bad as dogs that have been wandering alone for 2 weeks. Their paw pads are torn up, but not severely. And look at this." He pointed to Banner's neck, where a clear line in the fur showed where a collar had recently been removed. "That's from a working collar, the kind search and rescue dogs wear. Thick leather with metal rings for attaching gear." Mayor Hawkins's expression grew more skeptical.
"So where's the collar now?"
"Maybe," Sarah said thoughtfully. "We should let them show us." The suggestion sparked immediate debate among the townspeople. Some argued that following the dogs would be a waste of time, that they should focus on searching for more concrete evidence around the cabin. Others worried about venturing into the deep woods with another storm system moving in from the west. But Boone found himself studying Banner's behavior with growing conviction. The dog's actions were too purposeful to be random, too insistent to ignore. And there was something in the animal's eyes, an intelligence that spoke of important knowledge waiting to be shared. "I'll follow them," he said, standing up from the porch steps. "If they're trying to lead us somewhere, I want to know where." "Now hold on." Mayor Hawkins stepped forward. "If there's evidence out there, we can't have you contaminating it." "Then come with me," Boone replied. "All of you, if you want. But those dogs came to my cabin for a reason, and I don't think it was just for shelter." The debate continued for several more minutes, but Banner settled the matter by setting off toward the tree line with determined purpose. Sage followed immediately, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Doc Morrison. "Well," the old doctor called over his shoulder, "I've been curious about those dogs since I first saw them. Might as well find out what they're so eager to show us." One by one, the rest of the search party fell in behind him. Mayor Hawkins brought up the rear, muttering about proper procedure and contaminated evidence, but unwilling to let the group venture into the wilderness without his oversight. The dogs led them along a game trail that wound through dense stands of pine and aspen, climbing steadily toward the higher elevations where the missing search party had last been seen. The snow was knee-deep in places and the going was slow, but Banner and Sage moved with the confidence of animals following a familiar route. "They've been this way before," Jake Morrison observed, breathing hard from the climb. "Recently, too. Look at how they know exactly where to step." The trail crossed several small streams, frozen now, but still audible as water moved beneath the ice. Each time they reached one of these crossings, The dogs would pause, sniff carefully, and then continue with renewed purpose. After an hour of climbing, they reached a clearing dominated by a massive granite outcrop, the kind of landmark that served as a natural waypoint for travelers moving through the mountain passes. The dogs stopped here, circling the base of the rock formation with obvious agitation. "This is where the search party would have camped," Doc Morrison said, recognizing the location. "Good shelter, fresh water from that spring, and you can see the valley in 3 directions, but there was no sign of recent human habitation. No firing, no trampled snow, no equipment left behind. If the missing men had stopped here, they'd left no obvious trace." Banner, however, was focused on something specific. He'd found a spot near the base of the largest boulder and was digging frantically, throwing snow in all directions as he sought something buried beneath. "What's he found?" Sarah Chen moved closer, then stopped abruptly. Oh my word! Partially buried in the snow, revealed by Banner's digging, was a leather satchel, the kind used by men traveling through dangerous country to carry essential supplies. The leather was dark with moisture, but the brass buckles still gleamed. Mayor Hawkins pushed forward and carefully lifted the satchel from its snowy grave. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were personal items that answered the question of ownership immediately. A letter addressed to Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley from his sister in Denver. A small Bible with Caleb Wright written on the flyleaf. A photograph of a young woman, Jake Morrison's sweetheart back in town. Their gear, Mayor Hawkins said quietly. "But where are they?" The dogs had resumed their agitated circling, and now Sage had found something else. She was pawing at a section of snow that looked no different from the surrounding area, whining with increasing urgency. Doc Morrison knelt beside her and began brushing away the snow with his hands. What he uncovered made several people step back involuntarily. It was a boot, a heavy mountain boot still laced tight, and it was still attached to a leg. "Dear God," someone whispered. But as Doc Morrison continued to clear the snow, the truth became apparent. The leg was wooden, a crude prosthetic carved from pine and fitted with leather straps. "That's Caleb's peg leg," Jake Morrison said, his voice tight with emotion. "Lost his real leg in a mining accident 10 years ago. He's had that wooden one ever since." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If Caleb Wright's prosthetic leg was here, buried in the snow, then where was Caleb Wright? A man couldn't walk away from his only means of mobility, especially not in mountain country during winter. Banner had moved to yet another spot, his digging more frantic now. This time he uncovered a rifle, Tom Bradley's Winchester, recognizable by the distinctive silver inlay on the stock. The weapon was loaded but unfired, its barrel clear of snow, as if it had been protected until recently. "Something's wrong here," Sarah Chen said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "These items aren't scattered randomly. They're buried deliberately, like someone was hiding evidence." Mayor Hawkins straightened up, his face grim. "Or like someone wanted them found eventually. Question is, who buried them and why?" As if in answer to his question, both dogs suddenly raised their heads, ears pricked toward a sound none of the humans could detect. They stood frozen for a long moment, then Banner let out a howl that echoed off the granite walls around them. From somewhere deeper in the forest, another howl answered, long, mournful, and unmistakably human. The howl echoed through the mountain air like the cry of a lost soul, raising the hair on every neck in the clearing. It came from deeper in the forest, somewhere beyond the next ridge, and it carried a note of desperation that made everyone's blood run cold. "That's human," Doc Morrison said, grabbing his medical bag. "And whoever it is, they're in trouble." Banner and Sage immediately bolted toward the sound, their earlier hesitation replaced by urgent purpose. The search party followed, abandoning any pretense of careful evidence preservation in favor of reaching whoever had made that terrible sound. The terrain grew more treacherous as they climbed, with hidden rocks and fallen logs creating traps beneath the snow. Mayor Hawkins called out warnings to watch their footing, but the urgency of that echoing howl drove them forward despite the dangers. Boone found himself in the lead, his years of mountain living giving him an advantage in reading the landscape. He could see the signs the others missed, the slight depression that marked a safe path, the way snow gathered around obstacles, the subtle differences in color that indicated solid ground versus hidden crevasses. "Stay close to me," he called back to the group. "This section's unstable. One wrong step and you'll drop into a crevice that won't give you back." They crossed a frozen stream, the ice creaking ominously under their weight, and climbed a steep slope where the dogs' tracks were clearly visible in the snow. Banner and Sage had passed this way multiple times recently, wearing a path between Boone's cabin and whatever lay ahead. As they crested the ridge, the mystery began to resolve itself. Below them lay a natural depression in the mountainside, almost a hidden valley, sheltered by tall pines and accessible only through the narrow passage they'd just traversed. And there, at the bottom of the depression, smoke rose from what could only be a camp. "Well, I'll be damned," Mayor Hawkins muttered, pulling out his field glasses. "There's someone down there, all right." Through the magnification, they could see a crude shelter built against a large boulder, branches and canvas arranged to provide minimal protection from the elements. A small fire sent up the thin column of smoke they'd spotted, and beside it, a figure sat hunched in a blanket. "That's Tom Bradley," Jake Morrison said, his voice filled with relief. "I can see his hat," but as they made their way down into the depression, it became clear that relief was premature. The man by the fire was indeed Tom Bradley, but he was in terrible condition. His face was gaunt with starvation, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and something that might have been despair. When he looked up at their approach, he seemed to have trouble focusing, as if he wasn't entirely sure they were real. "Tom," Doc Morrison called out gently, approaching slowly. "It's Doc Morrison from Pine Ridge. We've been looking for you." Tom Bradley tried to stand, but collapsed back onto the log he'd been using as a seat. "Doc, how did you—" His voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible. "The dogs. Did they find you?" "They found Boone Calder," Mayor Hawkins said, kneeling beside the injured man. "Led us right to his cabin, then brought us here. Tom, where are Jake and Caleb?" At the mention of his companions, Tom Bradley's face crumpled. "Gone," he whispered. "Both of them. I couldn't." Doc Morrison was already examining him, checking for injuries, while Sarah Chen worked to build up the fire. Tom was suffering from exposure, dehydration, and what appeared to be a badly infected wound on his left leg. But the physical damage seemed secondary to whatever emotional trauma had reduced the confident deputy marshal to this broken shell. "Take your time," Doc Morrison said soothingly. "Tell us what happened when you're ready." While the doctor worked, Boone explored the makeshift camp. What he found painted a picture of desperate survival and careful planning. The shelter was more sophisticated than it appeared from a distance, built with the knowledge of a man who understood mountain survival. A cache of supplies was hidden beneath a lean-to of pine boughs, canned goods, medical supplies, even ammunition. Most significant was a small wooden cross driven into the ground near the edge of the camp. Carved into its surface were two names, Jake Morrison and Caleb Wright, along with dates from 2 weeks earlier. "Tom," Boone said gently, "we found some of your gear buried up by the granite outcrop. Caleb's leg, your rifle, personal items." Tom Bradley nodded weakly. "Had to hide the evidence. Couldn't let them find it before—" He stopped, looking around the circle of faces with confusion. "Before what?" "I can't remember why I thought that mattered." Dr. Morrison finished his examination and sat back on his heels. "He's been alone too long. Combination of exposure, infection, and isolation. His thinking's not entirely clear right now." But Tom's next words came out with startling clarity. "The avalanche wasn't natural. Someone triggered it on purpose." The statement hit the group like a physical blow. Mayor Hawkins leaned forward intently. "What do you mean, triggered on purpose?" "We were following tracks," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger as he focused on the memory. "Strange tracks, like someone had been watching the town from the high passes. Jake thought it might be rustlers scouting the valley herds. We tracked them up to Devil's Backbone, that narrow ridge above Timber Creek." He paused to drink from the canteen Doc Morrison offered, then continued. "The tracks led to a camp. Recent camp, maybe 3 or 4 men, but they'd cleared out before we got there. Just the fire ring and some garbage left behind. We were investigating when we heard the gunshot. Gunshot, Sarah Chen asked. Single shot from above us on the ridge. I knew immediately what it meant. Someone had shot into the snowpack to trigger a slide. I yelled for Jake and Caleb to run, but there wasn't time. The whole face of the mountain came down. Tom's hands shook as he described the avalanche. I was furthest from the slide path. Got knocked down and buried, but not deep. Took me an hour to dig myself out. When I did, his voice broke. Jake and Caleb were gone, buried under 20 feet of snow and rock. The implications of his story settled over the group like a cold wind. If Tom was telling the truth, the missing search party hadn't been victims of an accident or natural disaster. They'd been murdered. Who would do such a thing? Sarah whispered. I don't know, Tom replied. But I spent 2 weeks trying to find out. The dogs helped me dig where I thought Jake and Caleb might be buried. We found some of their gear, but he gestured helplessly toward the wooden cross. The snow was too deep, the avalanche too complete. I couldn't recover their bodies. Mayor Hawkins was taking notes in a small leather book. You said there were tracks from multiple men. Any idea who they might be? Tom shook his head. Professional tracks. Men who knew how to move through mountain country without leaving much sign. But whoever they were, they didn't want to be discovered. And they were willing to kill to keep their secrets. Banner had found something else while the humans talked. The dog emerged from behind the shelter, carrying an object in his mouth. A leather map case. Water damaged, but intact. Inside the case were surveyor's maps of the entire Pine Ridge Valley, marked with notations in a handwriting none of them recognized. Red X's marked specific locations throughout the area, including several spots near town that had no obvious significance. What are they mapping? Jake Morrison asked, studying the markings. But it was Sarah Chen who noticed the most disturbing detail. Look at the date on these maps. They're recent, made within the last few months. Someone's been surveying our entire valley, marking specific locations for some purpose. Tom Bradley struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on Doc Morrison's arm. That's why I couldn't come back to town. Had to figure out what they were planning. But I've been alone too long, can't think straight anymore. Well, you're not alone now, Mayor Hawkins said firmly. And we're going to get to the bottom of this. But first, we need to get you back to town where Doc can treat you properly. As they prepared for the difficult journey back to Pine Ridge, Boone studied the surveyor's maps with growing unease. The marked locations formed a pattern he didn't like, a systematic survey of the valley's most vulnerable points. Water sources, mountain passes, the routes connecting Pine Ridge to the outside world. It looked like preparation for something much larger than simple rustling. It looked like preparation for a siege. The journey back to Pine Ridge took most of the afternoon, with frequent stops to rest Tom Bradley and adjust the makeshift stretcher they'd fashioned from pine branches and rope. The deputy marshal drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever climbing despite Doc Morrison's efforts to keep him comfortable. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, word of their discovery had somehow preceded them. Sarah Chen had sent her youngest clerk ahead on horseback when they'd stopped at the halfway point. And now it seemed the entire population of Pine Ridge had gathered in the main street. Boone found himself the center of attention in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. People who hadn't spoken to him in 3 years now pressed close, asking questions about the rescue, about what they'd found in the mountains, about whether the threat was real. Give the man some space, Mayor Hawkins called out, but his voice lacked conviction. The maps they'd discovered had shaken him as much as anyone, and Boone could see the calculations running behind his eyes, how to protect a town that might be under surveillance by unknown enemies. They carried Tom Bradley directly to Doc Morrison's clinic, a small building attached to the back of his house. While the doctor worked to clean and dress the infected wound, Mayor Hawkins spread the surveyor's maps across his desk in the adjacent office. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the red markings scattered across the valley. "Someone's been watching us for months. These X's mark every approach to town, every defensible position, every water source." Sarah Chen studied the maps with the practical eye of someone who'd run a business through good times and bad. It's not just surveillance, she said quietly. It's tactical planning. See how they've marked the grain silos, the telegraph office, the bridge over Willow Creek. Those are strategic targets. The implications were staggering. Pine Ridge was a peaceful mountain community, far from the territorial disputes and range wars that plagued other parts of Colorado. They had no enemies, no resources valuable enough to justify the kind of organized threat the maps suggested. But why? Asked Mrs. Patterson, who'd insisted on staying despite her advanced age. What could anyone want with our little town? It was Boone who provided the answer, though he took no pleasure in the revelation. Location, he said simply. Pine Ridge controls the northern pass through the mountains. Anyone wanting to move large groups of men or supplies between the eastern slopes and the western territories would need to control this valley. Mayor Hawkins paled. You think this is about the railroad? The Denver and Rio Grande Railway had been surveying routes through the Colorado mountains for over a year, seeking the most practical path for their westward expansion. Several possible routes had been proposed, but the northern pass, the one that ran directly through Pine Ridge, offered the gentlest grades and most reliable water sources. Railroad companies have been known to use questionable methods to secure right-of-way, Sarah said carefully. But murder? Triggering avalanches to kill search parties. That seems extreme even for them. From the clinic came the sound of Tom Bradley's voice, weak but insistent. Doc Morrison appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. He's asking for you. Boone says he needs to tell you something about the dogs inside the clinic. Tom Bradley lay propped up on pillows, his leg elevated and wrapped in clean bandages. The fever had broken, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been in the mountains. Boone, he said, gripping the mountain man's wrist with surprising strength. Banner and Sage, they saved my life more than once these past 2 weeks. But there's something you need to know about why they came to you. Boone pulled a chair close to the bed. What do you mean? I didn't send them to your cabin by accident. I told them to find you specifically. The revelation hit Boone like a physical blow. You told them to find me? But how could you know? Dogs are smart, Tom interrupted. Smarter than most people give them credit for. Banner's been to your place before, back when you used to come to town regular. He remembered the scent trail, remembered the way. When I realized I couldn't make it back myself, couldn't risk leading whoever killed Jake and Caleb straight to town, I sent the dogs to the one person I knew could help. Tom reached under his pillow and withdrew something wrapped in oilcloth. A small object he pressed into Boone's hands. Found this in the ruins of their camp, hidden under a rock, like they were trying to protect it. Boone unwrapped the cloth to reveal a compass, not the standard military issue carried by most outdoorsmen, but an expensive surveyor's instrument with brass fittings and precise calibrations. Engraved on the back was a name, Morrison and Associates, Land Development, Denver. Morrison and Associates, Sarah Chen read over Boone's shoulder. Any relation to Jake Morrison? No relation, Tom said firmly. I asked Jake about that when we found the compass. He'd never heard of any Morrison and Associates in Denver, which means either it's a coincidence or someone's using a false name. Mayor Hawkins examined the compass with growing concern. This is expensive equipment, professional grade. Whoever owned this wasn't just passing through. They were here for serious surveying work. There's more, Tom continued. The camp we found wasn't their main base. Too small, too exposed. Somewhere in these mountains there's a larger operation. And if they're willing to kill to protect it, they're planning something big. Dr. Morrison appeared with a steaming mug of willow bark tea. Tom needs rest. His body's been through hell, and pushing too hard now could set back his recovery. But Tom wasn't finished. Boone, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. You've been living up there alone for 3 years. Have you seen anything unusual? Riders passing through? Signs of camps or activity in the high country? Boone thought carefully. His isolation had been deliberate, but it hadn't been complete. The mountains revealed their secrets to those who knew how to listen. Strange sounds sometimes, he admitted. Sounds that didn't fit the natural patterns. And there have been nights when I've seen lights moving through the high passes, too organized to be lost travelers, too purposeful to be accidents. "Why didn't you report it?" Mayor Hawkins asked. Boone looked at him with the patience of a man who'd learned hard lessons about community expectations. "Report it to who? You folks made it clear I wasn't welcome in town anymore. Besides, mountain country's always been a place where men come to disappear. I figured it wasn't my business." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, filled with the weight of 3 years of mutual avoidance and misunderstanding. Sarah Chen was the first to break it. "Well, it's our business now," she said firmly. "All of our business. If there's an organized threat to Pine Ridge, we need to work together to meet it." From outside came the sound of horses arriving at speed. Multiple riders pushing their mounts hard despite the dangerous conditions. Mayor Hawkins moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. "Well, damn," he muttered. "Looks like our troubles are about to get more complicated." A group of well-dressed men were dismounting in front of the town hall, city folks by their appearance, with expensive coats and the soft look of men who spent their time in offices rather than outdoors. But they rode like men comfortable with horses and rough country, and they carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to getting their way. The lead rider was a tall man with silver hair and a carefully trimmed beard. He carried a leather satchel and moved with the purposeful stride of someone conducting important business. Behind him came 4 other men, all armed, all watching the townspeople with the calculating gaze of professionals. "Anyone recognize them?" Sarah asked. It was Tom Bradley who answered, his voice tight with recognition and something that might have been fear. "The tall one's name is Morrison. Clayton Morrison. And if he's here, it means they know we found their maps." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The surveyor's compass hadn't been left behind by accident. It had been planted. A calling card from men confident enough in their power to sign their work. Outside, Clayton Morrison was already striding toward the clinic, his expensive boots clicking against the frozen ground. Whatever conversation was about to happen, Boone suspected it would determine the fate of Pine Ridge and everyone in it. Clayton Morrison entered the clinic without knocking, his presence filling the small room like smoke from a badly banked fire. He was a man in his 50s, well-fed and expensively dressed. But there was nothing soft about his pale grey eyes or the way he surveyed the assembled townspeople with cool calculation. "Deputy Marshal Bradley," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "I'm relieved to see you're safe. When we heard about the tragic accident that claimed your companions, we feared the worst." Tom Bradley struggled to sit up straighter, his jaw set with determination despite his weakened condition. "Wasn't any accident, Morrison. You and I both know that." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or professional respect for a worthy opponent. "Accidents happen in mountain country, Deputy. Avalanches are unpredictable natural phenomena. Even experienced outdoorsmen can find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Natural phenomena don't fire warning shots." Tom replied, "Ah." Morrison pulled out a leather chair and seated himself without invitation. "That would be my associate, Mr. Garrett. Former Army sharpshooter, I'm afraid, with an unfortunate tendency toward theatrical gestures. He was attempting to signal your party to avoid a dangerous area. Tragically, his warning came too late. The lie was delivered with such smooth confidence that for a moment even Boone found himself wondering if it might be true. But the surveyor's compass in his pocket felt heavy as lead, and Tom Bradley's haunted eyes told a different story. Mayor Hawkins stepped forward, his official bearing somewhat undermined by the nervous sweat on his forehead. "Mr. Morrison, what brings you to Pine Ridge? And why should we believe anything you're telling us about Deputy Bradley's ordeal?" Morrison opened his leather satchel and withdrew a sheaf of legal documents, spreading them across Doc Morrison's desk with the casual confidence of a man who'd done this before. "I represent the Colorado Mountain Development Company," he said. "We're conducting feasibility studies for potential railroad expansion through this region. All perfectly legal, I assure you. We have territorial authorization for our surveys. Sarah Chen moved closer to examine the documents. Her years of running a business had taught her to read legal papers with a skeptical eye, and what she saw there made her frown deepen. These documents authorize survey work, she said slowly, but they're dated 3 months ago. According to Deputy Bradley, your people have been operating in these mountains for much longer than that. Preliminary assessments, Morrison replied smoothly. We like to be thorough in our evaluations before committing to expensive legal procedures. Thorough enough to map every strategic point in our valley? Mayor Hawkins pulled out the surveyor's maps they'd recovered from Tom's camp. Thorough enough to mark our grain silos, our telegraph office, our defensive positions? For the first time, Morrison's composure cracked slightly. His eyes fixed on the maps with an intensity that confirmed their importance, though his voice remained level. Standard survey work includes notation of all significant structures and geographic features. Nothing unusual about that. It was Boone who spoke next, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of a man who'd spent years reading the truth in nature's smallest signs. Your compass says different, he said, pulling the surveyor's instrument from his pocket. This here's precision equipment, worth more than most folks in Pine Ridge make in a year. But it was hidden in your people's camp like evidence of something shameful. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he recognized the compass. That's stolen property. I'll thank you to return it immediately. Evidence of murder is what it is, Tom Bradley said, his voice gaining strength. Jake Morrison and Caleb Wright are dead because they discovered your operation. And you killed them to keep it secret. Deputy Bradley has been through a terrible ordeal, Morrison said, his tone now carrying a note of condescension. Exposure, isolation, and trauma can cause a man's memory to become unreliable. Perhaps what he thinks he remembers isn't entirely accurate. The suggestion that Tom was lying or delusional sparked immediate anger from several townspeople, but Morrison raised his hand for silence. However, he continued, the Colorado Mountain Development Company is not unreasonable. We understand that recent events have caused considerable distress to your community. We're prepared to offer compensation for your troubles. He withdrew another document from his satchel, this one thick with official seals and legal language. A purchase agreement for the entire Pine Ridge Valley. Fair market value for all properties, plus a substantial bonus for quick acceptance. Every family would receive enough money to relocate comfortably anywhere they choose. The silence that followed was complete. Even Doc Morrison stopped his quiet preparations to stare at the document. You want to buy our town? Mrs. Patterson asked, her elderly voice sharp with disbelief. The railroad needs clear right-of-way for efficient construction, Morrison explained. Pine Ridge sits directly in the path of the most practical route through these mountains. Relocating the town would benefit everyone. You'd receive generous compensation, and the railroad could proceed without the complications of building around existing structures. And if we refuse? Mayor Hawkins asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Morrison's smile was as cold as mountain ice. I'm sure reasonable people can reach a reasonable agreement. After all, you've already seen how dangerous these mountains can be. Accidents happen. Natural disasters occur without warning. It would be tragic if Pine Ridge suffered any further misfortunes. The threat was delivered with such civilized language that it took a moment for its full implications to register. But when they did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah Chen was the first to respond, her voice vibrating with controlled fury. You're threatening us. Our families, our children, our entire way of life. I'm offering you a business proposition, Morrison corrected. A generous one, considering the alternative. The alternative being what happened to Jake and Caleb. Tom Bradley struggled to his feet, swaying but determined. Murder by avalanche? Accidents that aren't accidents? Morrison stood as well, smoothing his expensive coat with deliberate calm. The alternative, Deputy, is the reality of progress. The railroad is coming through these mountains, whether Pine Ridge exists or not. The only question is whether your community chooses to profit from that inevitability or resist it, From outside came the sound of more horses, Morrison's men moving into position around the clinic. Through the window, Boone could see armed figures taking up strategic positions throughout the town. However many men Morrison had brought, they'd clearly planned for the possibility that negotiations might not go smoothly. "How long do we have to consider your offer?" Mayor Hawkins asked, his political instincts still functioning despite the circumstances. 24 hours, Morrison replied. "After that, I'm afraid the terms become significantly less favorable." He gathered his documents and headed for the door, then paused and looked back at the assembled townspeople. One more thing. Deputy Bradley's unfortunate experience in the mountains seems to have left him somewhat confused about recent events. For his own safety and the safety of others, I'd recommend he remain under medical supervision until his memory clears. Sometimes, trauma can cause men to make wild accusations that could prove embarrassing to everyone involved. The message was clear. Tom Bradley's testimony would not be allowed to reach territorial authorities. After Morrison left, the clinic fell silent except for the sound of Tom's labored breathing and the distant voices of armed men positioning themselves around Pine Ridge. "Well," Doc Morrison said finally, "I guess we know what we're up against now." Boone moved to the window, studying the positions Morrison's men had taken. Professional deployment, he noted. Men who understood tactics and weren't afraid to use them. "Question is," he said quietly, "what are we going to do about it?" The town meeting that evening was unlike any Pine Ridge had ever seen. The community hall was packed beyond capacity, with families crowded together on benches and lining the walls. Children sat wide-eyed in their parents' laps, while their elders debated the future of everything they'd built in this valley. Mayor Hawkins had called the meeting to discuss Morrison's ultimatum. But the conversation quickly revealed divisions that 3 years of relative peace had allowed to fester beneath the surface. Some families, particularly those struggling with failed crops or mounting debts, saw Morrison's offer as providential. Others viewed it as nothing short of extortion. $20,000 for my ranch, said old Henrik Larson, his weathered hands shaking as he held Morrison's purchase documents. "That's more money than I've seen in my entire life. Could set my grandchildren up proper in San Francisco or Denver. It's blood money," Sarah Chen replied sharply. "Money paid for a town built on the graves of Jake Morrison and Caleb Wright. How do you think you'll sleep at night knowing what it cost?" The debate continued for over an hour, growing more heated as neighbors who'd lived side by side for decades discovered fundamental disagreements about honor, survival, and the price of progress. Mayor Hawkins tried to maintain order, but his authority seemed diminished by the magnitude of the crisis facing them. It was Mrs. Patterson who finally cut through, the arguing with a question that silenced the entire hall. "Has anyone considered that maybe Mr. Morrison isn't telling us the whole truth about what he wants?" The elderly woman stood slowly, leaning heavily on her walking stick, but speaking with the clarity of someone who'd lived through enough deception to recognize it when she saw it. "I've been thinking about those maps we found," she continued. "All those marked locations, all that careful surveying. Seems like an awful lot of work just to run railroad tracks through the valley." Boone, who'd been standing quietly near the back of the hall, felt something click into place in his mind. Mrs. Patterson was right. The surveyor's maps showed far more detail than any railroad would require. "May I see those maps again?" he asked Mayor Hawkins. As the documents were passed back to him, Boone studied them with the trained eye of a man who'd spent years reading the landscape for survival. What he saw made his blood run cold. "These aren't railroad surveys," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "They're mining surveys." The statement landed like a thunderclap. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd to look over Boone's shoulder as he pointed out the evidence. "See these elevation markers? These soil composition notes? This isn't about laying tracks. It's about extracting something from the ground." Mayor Hawkins examined the maps more closely, his face paling as he recognized the implications. "But there's no gold in Pine Ridge Valley. No silver either. The geological surveys from 10 years ago were very clear about that. Maybe they weren't looking for gold," Boone said grimly. At that moment, The hall doors burst open and Tom Bradley stumbled inside, still weak from his ordeal, but driven by urgent purpose. Doc Morrison was right behind him, protesting that his patient shouldn't be out of bed. "Had to come," Tom gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "Heard about the meeting. There's something you all need to know, something I remembered while I was lying there thinking about those maps." He made his way slowly to the front of the hall, supported by his friend Doc Morrison. The crowd parted before him, their faces showing a mixture of sympathy and desperate hope that he might have answers to their impossible situation. "The night before the avalanche," Tom began, his voice still weak but gaining strength, "we found something else in their camp. Something I didn't mention before because I thought it wasn't important." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small cloth bag, the kind used by prospectors to carry ore samples. Inside were several chunks of dark rock that looked ordinary to most of the assembled townspeople, but Boone recognized them immediately. "Coal," he said quietly. "Not just any coal," Tom confirmed. "High-grade anthracite. Jake Morrison knew a thing or two about mining from his father's day. He said these samples were some of the finest he'd ever seen. The revelation hit the community like a physical blow. Coal meant industry, wealth, and transformation on a scale that dwarfed even railroad development. It meant their peaceful mountain valley sitting atop a fortune that would attract attention from mining interests across the country. But the territorial surveys, Mayor Hawkins began, were conducted 10 years ago using old methods, Tom interrupted. Modern geological techniques can find deposits the old surveys missed. And if Morrison's people have found coal here, good coal in substantial quantities, then Pine Ridge isn't just in the way of progress. It's sitting on top of it. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place in her sharp mind. That explains the thorough mapping. They're not just surveying for railroad right-of-way. They're planning the entire industrial development. Mining operations, processing facilities, worker housing. They want to turn our valley into a company town. The implications were staggering. Coal mining would require hundreds of workers, massive equipment and infrastructure that would completely transform the landscape. The Pine Ridge they knew, the peaceful community of families and small farms, would cease to exist entirely. 24 hours, Sarah Chen said bitterly. Morrison gave us 24 hours to accept his generous offer. But if we refuse, if word gets out about coal deposits here, every mining company in Colorado will descend on this valley like vultures. Maybe that's not entirely bad, suggested Henrik Larsen. Competition might drive up the offers. Could mean even more money for everyone. It was Boone who voiced what several others were thinking, but hadn't dared say aloud. "Henrik, you're thinking like a man who's never seen what coal mining does to a place." "I have. Spent some time in Pennsylvania before I came west. Coal country doesn't make people rich. It makes companies rich and leaves the land poisoned for generations." He moved to the front of the hall, holding the coal samples where everyone could see them. "This coal represents wealth, that's true, but not wealth for us. Wealth for men like Morrison who have the capital and connections to extract it. What we'd get is the privilege of watching our home destroyed, our water poisoned, our air filled with coal dust, while we work dangerous jobs for company wages in a company town where we can't afford to live." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of hard truths. Even Henrik Larsen looked thoughtful as he considered Boone's words. It was Doc Morrison who asked the question everyone was avoiding. "So what do we do? If Morrison's people have found coal here, and if they're willing to kill to protect their secret, how do we protect ourselves?" "We fight," Tom Bradley said simply, though his weakened condition made the words seem almost laughable. "With what?" Mayor Hawkins asked. "Morrison has professional gunmen. We're farmers and shopkeepers. Most of us haven't fired a shot in anger since the territorial conflicts 15 years ago." But Sarah Chen was studying the maps again, her business-trained mind working through possibilities that others hadn't considered. "Maybe we don't fight Morrison directly," she said slowly. "Maybe we fight his monopoly." "What do you mean?" Boone asked. "These surveys, this coal evidence, it only has value if Morrison's company controls it exclusively. But what if word got out? What if other mining companies learned about the deposits here? Mayor Hawkins shook his head. You said yourself that would just bring more vultures. Not if we controlled how the information spread, Sarah replied, her voice gaining excitement as the plan formed in her mind. Morrison's offering to buy us out because he needs clear title to the land before he can begin development. But if we could get this evidence to the right people, territorial authorities, competing mining companies, even newspaper reporters, Morrison's monopoly would be broken. Tom Bradley understood immediately. Create a bidding war. Force them to compete for legitimacy instead of using violence to maintain secrecy. Exactly. But it would have to be done carefully, quickly, and in a way that Morrison couldn't stop or control. From outside came the sound of horses moving through the town, Morrison's men maintaining their watch, reminding everyone that Pine Ridge was effectively under siege. Boone looked around the crowded hall, seeing neighbors who'd become strangers during his years of isolation, families facing an impossible choice between financial security and their way of life. There's one problem. With your plan, he said to Sarah, Morrison's not going to just sit back and let us expose his operation. We've got maybe 12 hours before he gets suspicious about this meeting. And after that, he didn't need to finish. Everyone understood that after Morrison's deadline passed, the situation would become significantly more dangerous for anyone who opposed his plans. Then we'd better get started, Sarah Chen said, her voice carrying the determination that had kept her general store profitable through good times and bad. Because if we're going to save Pine Ridge, we're going to have to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast a man who's already proven he's willing to kill to get what he wants. In the back of the hall, Banner and Sage had been lying quietly beside the door, but now both dogs rose to their feet, ears pricked toward the windows, as if sensing movement outside that human ears couldn't detect. The time for talking was about to end. The plan Sarah Chen proposed was ambitious, dangerous, and their only hope of survival as a community. Working through the night, they divided into 3 groups, each with a critical mission that had to succeed for Pine Ridge to have any chance against Morrison's operation. The first group, led by Mayor Hawkins, would focus on legal documentation, preparing sworn statements, copying the surveyor's maps, and creating a comprehensive record of Morrison's threats and the murders of Jake Morrison and Caleb Wright. This evidence would need to reach territorial authorities in Denver, along with copies sent to major newspapers in Colorado Springs and Pueblo. The second group, organized around Sarah Chen's business connections, would work on communication. Sarah had maintained correspondence with merchants and suppliers throughout Colorado, building a network that could carry messages faster than Morrison might expect. Her plan was to alert competing mining companies about the coal deposits while simultaneously informing federal authorities about the illegal activities. The third group was the most dangerous, and it fell to Boone Calder to lead it. Someone has to get to Morrison's main camp. Sarah had explained during the planning session, we need more evidence, more documentation of their operation, and we need to know exactly how many men we're facing. Boone had accepted the assignment without hesitation, though privately he understood it might be a suicide mission. Morrison's men were professionals, and the mountain camp would be heavily guarded. But his 3 years of isolation had honed skills that might give him an advantage. The ability to move through wilderness without leaving tracks, to observe without being observed, to survive in conditions that would challenge even experienced outdoorsmen. Tom Bradley had insisted on joining him despite his weakened condition. I know where their camp is, he'd argued. And I know their routine. You'll need someone who's seen their operation firsthand, Doc Morrison had protested, but Tom's determination was absolute. Those men killed my friends, he'd said quietly. I won't sit safely in town while others risk their lives to bring them to justice. As dawn approached, the 3 groups prepared for their missions. The community hall had been transformed into a war room, with maps spread across tables and citizens working with the focused intensity of people fighting for their survival. Mrs. Patterson had appointed herself coordinator, her sharp mind tracking the multiple moving parts of their desperate plan. She'd also contributed something unexpected, a collection of official documents and correspondence that revealed her to be far more than the simple boarding house keeper most people assumed. I wasn't always running a boarding house in Pine Ridge, she'd explained. When Mayor Hawkins questioned her knowledge of territorial law, before I came here, I worked for the Territorial Governor's Office in Denver. I know which officials can be trusted and which ones might already be in Morrison's pocket. Her revelations had reframed their understanding of their situation. Mrs. Patterson's connections could potentially reach the highest levels of territorial government. But they'd also learned that Morrison's Colorado Mountain Development Company had influential supporters in Denver. We're not just fighting a mining company, she'd warned them. We're fighting a network of business and political interests that may reach all the way to Washington. This coal deposit could be worth millions of dollars. Men have started wars over less. As Boone prepared for his reconnaissance mission, he found himself thinking about Martha and the life they'd built together in simpler times. She would have been proud of what Pine Ridge was attempting, he realized. A community choosing principle over profit, standing together against overwhelming odds. He packed light, dried food, water, ammunition for his rifle, and the surveyor's compass they'd recovered from Morrison's advance camp. The compass might prove useful for navigation, but more importantly, it was evidence that needed to be preserved. Tom Bradley was moving better than expected, his determination seeming to overcome his physical limitations. Doc Morrison had provided him with pain medication and strict instructions about not overexerting himself. But they all knew the mission would push him beyond what his injured body could safely handle. "If something happens to me up there," Tom said quietly as they prepared to leave, "make sure my testimony reaches the Territorial Marshal's office. Everything I saw, everything I remember about the murders, it's all written down in the statement Mayor Hawkins helped me prepare." Banner and Sage had been restless all night, sensing the tension and preparation around them. As Boone and Tom prepared to leave, both dogs moved to join them, their intentions clear. "They know the way to Morrison's main camp," Tom observed. "And they've got senses we don't. Might be useful to have them along." Sarah Chen had worked through the night, writing letters and preparing packages for her courier network. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity: flood multiple channels with information simultaneously, making it impossible for Morrison to suppress the truth through intimidation or violence. "I've got riders ready to leave for Denver, Colorado Springs and Pueblo," she reported. "Each one carries complete documentation about the coal deposits and Morrison's activities. Even if Morrison intercepts some of them, others will get through." Mayor Hawkins had focused on the legal framework, preparing documents that would hold up in territorial court, while also creating claims that might complicate Morrison's plans. "If we can establish prior mineral rights claims on behalf of the townspeople," he explained. "Morrison's company will have to go through lengthy legal proceedings to clear the titles. That buys us time, and time is what we need most." As the sun rose over Pine Ridge, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley, the three groups began their missions. Sarah's couriers departed at intervals, taking different routes to avoid detection. Mayor Hawkins set up in the telegraph office, preparing to send messages the moment the morning operator arrived. Boone and Tom, accompanied by Banner and Sage, slipped out of town through the back trail that led toward the high country. The route would take them past Boone's cabin and then into the wilderness areas where Morrison's main operation was hidden. The journey proved more difficult than expected. Tom's injuries slowed their progress, and the dogs showed increasing anxiety as they moved deeper into the mountains. Several times, Banner led them away from what appeared to be the most direct route, his behavior suggesting hidden dangers that human senses couldn't detect. Morrison's got sentries posted, Tom realized after the third detour. Banner remembers where they are. The revelation was both encouraging and frightening. It meant the dogs could guide them safely through Morrison's perimeter. But it also confirmed that they were moving toward a heavily defended position. By midday, they'd reached the ridge overlooking the hidden valley where Morrison's main camp was located. What they saw through Boone's spyglass exceeded their worst fears. The operation was massive, far larger than anything suggested by the advance camp they'd discovered earlier. At least 50 men were visible, along with sophisticated mining equipment that must have cost a fortune to transport into the mountains. Temporary buildings housed what appeared to be a complete geological survey operation, with laboratories for testing ore samples and facilities for processing preliminary extractions. "They're not just surveying," Boone said grimly. "They're already mining. That whole operation down there, it's been running for months." Tom Bradley studied the camp through the spyglass, his face grim with recognition. "Some of those men were at the advance camp when we tracked them. I can see the one Morrison called Garrett, the sharpshooter, who triggered the avalanche, but it was what they found hidden in a grove of pine trees above the camp that provided the most crucial evidence of Morrison's operations. Crude cemetery contained at least a dozen graves, marked only with wooden stakes driven into the frozen ground. The implications were chilling. Morrison's operation had been eliminating obstacles and witnesses for much longer than anyone had suspected. "How many people has he killed to keep this secret?" Tom whispered. Boone was examining the graves more closely, looking for any evidence that might identify the victims. What he found made his blood run cold. Personal items buried with the bodies, including badges, jewelry, and clothing that suggested some of the dead had been law enforcement officers. He's been systematically eliminating anyone who might expose his operation, Boone realized. Territory officials, competing prospectors, anyone who got too close to the truth. They spent the afternoon documenting everything they could see, sketching the layout of the camp, counting personnel and equipment, and gathering evidence that would prove the scope of Morrison's illegal activities. But as evening approached, they faced a critical decision. The evidence they'd gathered would be invaluable in exposing Morrison's operation, but getting it back to Pine Ridge safely would require them to evade the extensive patrol network Morrison had established throughout the mountains. "We could try to get closer," Tom suggested. "Maybe find written records, financial documents, something that would prove the political connections Mrs. Patterson warned us about." Boone considered the suggestion, weighing the potential value of additional evidence against the almost certain death that would result from being caught. Morrison's men had already proven their willingness to kill, and the isolated location would make any confrontation entirely one-sided. It was Banner who made the decision for them. The dog suddenly stiffened, ears pricked toward the camp below. Within moments, Sage joined him. Both animals focused on something that had changed in the valley. Through the spyglass, Boone could see increased activity around the camp's perimeter. Guards were moving into new positions, and several riders were preparing to depart, heading in the direction of Pine Ridge. "They know," Tom said grimly. "Somehow Morrison's figured out what we're planning." The race was on. Morrison's riders would reach Pine Ridge within hours, probably in time to intercept Sarah's couriers and Mayor Hawkins's communications. The carefully planned effort to expose Morrison's operation was about to become a desperate fight for survival. As they prepared for a dangerous descent through Morrison's patrol network, Boone found himself thinking about the choice that had started everything: his decision to bring 2 freezing dogs into his cabin during a blizzard. That simple act of mercy had led to this moment, when the fate of an entire community hung in the balance. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to save 2 animals, he'd uncovered a conspiracy that threatened everything he'd once called home. Now the question was whether the courage that had driven him to help those dogs would be enough to save the people of Pine Ridge from the most dangerous enemy they'd ever faced. The descent from Morrison's camp became a deadly game of cat and mouse played across treacherous mountain terrain. Boone led Tom Bradley and the 2 dogs through a maze of snow-covered ravines and dense timber. using every skill his years of isolation had taught him to avoid the patrol routes. Banner's memory revealed they were halfway to Pine Ridge when the shooting started. The first gunshots echoed across the valley from the direction of town, not the random firing of celebration or hunting, but the deliberate, sustained volleys that meant organized violence. Morrison's riders had reached Pine Ridge ahead of schedule, and the community's carefully planned resistance was under attack. "We're too late," Tom gasped, his injuries making the forced march almost unbearable, despite his determination. But Boone was studying the patterns of gunfire with the analytical mind of a man who'd survived 3 years in country where sound carried vital information. "Maybe not," he said grimly. "That's defensive fire. Our people are shooting from fixed positions. If Morrison had taken the town completely, the firing would have stopped by now." They pushed harder, abandoning caution for speed as the sounds of battle intensified. Banner and Sage seemed to understand the urgency, ranging ahead to scout the safest route while staying close enough to guide their human companions around obstacles and dangers. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Pine Ridge, the scene below made Boone's heart sink. Morrison's men had taken positions around the town's perimeter, using the buildings they'd scouted during their earlier surveillance to create a siege perimeter. Smoke rose from several structures, and the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed constantly, but the townspeople were fighting back with more coordination than Morrison had probably expected. Defensive positions had been established in the church, the general store, and the town hall, buildings that provided good fields of fire and strong defensive positions. Sarah's plan worked, at least partially, Tom observed, pointing to a group of riders disappearing down the eastern trail. Some of the couriers got out before Morrison's men arrived. Through his spyglass, Boone could see the tactical situation developing. Morrison had superior numbers and professional fighters, but the townspeople held defensive positions and local knowledge. The battle could go either way, depending on how long Pine Ridge could hold out and whether help was coming from the territorial authorities. What concerned him most was the systematic way Morrison's men were advancing. This wasn't a random assault, it was a coordinated military operation designed to capture the town with minimal damage to the infrastructure Morrison would need for his mining operation. They're not trying to destroy Pine Ridge, he realized. They're trying to capture it intact. That observation suggested Morrison still hoped to maintain some pretense of legitimacy. If he could take control of the town and eliminate the key witnesses, he might still be able to present his operation as a legal business venture that had encountered unfortunate resistance from unreasonable locals. "We need to get down there," Tom said, checking his ammunition. "My people are fighting for their lives," but Boone was thinking tactically, considering options beyond a direct assault on Morrison's superior forces. The reconnaissance mission had given him crucial intelligence about Morrison's operation, and that knowledge might be more valuable than 2 additional rifles in the town's defense. "Tom, how good are you at remembering details under pressure?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you could get to the telegraph office and send a message to the territorial marshal, what would you tell him that would bring federal intervention immediately?" Tom considered the question, understanding the implications. A general request for help might be ignored or delayed by Morrison's political connections. But specific information about murders, illegal mining operations, and violations of federal territorial law would demand immediate investigation. "The graves," he said finally. "If I could describe the cemetery we found, especially if some of those victims were federal officers, that would trigger an immediate response." Boone nodded grimly. "Then that's what we do. Get you to the telegraph office, send a message that will bring the cavalry, literally if necessary." The plan was simple in concept, but extremely dangerous in execution. The telegraph office sat in the center of town, surrounded by Morrison's men, and currently under siege. Getting Tom there would require moving through hostile territory while avoiding detection by professional gunmen. But Banner and Sage provided an unexpected advantage. The dogs knew Pine Ridge as well as they knew the mountain trails. and their ability to detect human presence at distances beyond normal hearing gave them advance warning of threats. "Follow the dogs," Boone told Tom as they began their descent. "They'll find us a path that avoids Morrison's sentries." The approach took them along the creek bed that ran behind the main street, using the natural depression and the cover of willows and cottonwoods to mask their movement. The sound of gunfire grew louder as they drew closer, and they could hear voices shouting orders in the professional tones of experienced fighters. They were 50 yards from the telegraph office when Banner suddenly froze, his body rigid with alarm. Through the trees, they could see 2 of Morrison's men positioned to watch the rear approach to the building, exactly the route they'd planned to use. But as Boone studied the situation, he realized the guards weren't just watching for intruders. They were preparing to burn the telegraph office, ensuring that no messages could reach the outside world. The battle for Pine Ridge was about to become a race against time, with the town's only connection to federal authority hanging in the balance. The 2 guards at the telegraph office were professionals, but they weren't expecting an attack from someone who'd spent 3 years learning to move through wilderness without disturbing so much as a twig. Boone approached them with the patience of a hunter, using the sound of gunfire from the main battle to mask any noise his movement might create. The first guard went down silently, taken from behind before he could raise an alarm. The second had time to turn, his hand reaching for his weapon, but Banner was faster. The dog's attack knocked the man off balance long enough for Boone to finish what needed finishing. "Clear," Boone called softly to Tom, who emerged from the tree line, moving as quickly as his injuries allowed. Inside the telegraph office, they found operator Jimmy Chen, Sarah's younger brother, crouched behind his desk with a rifle pointed at the door. His relief at seeing friendly faces was obvious, but his report was grim. "They cut the main line about an hour ago," he said. "But I managed to get one message out before they did. Told the territorial marshal that Pine Ridge was under attack by armed men claiming to represent mining interests." "Did you get a reply?" Tom asked, already moving toward the telegraph key. "Brief one. Marshal's office acknowledged receipt and said they were investigating, but that could mean anything from immediate response to filing the message and forgetting about it." Tom sat down at the telegraph key, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years in law enforcement. The message he composed was precise, urgent, and devastating. "Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley, reporting multiple federal crimes. Pine Ridge, Colorado, stop. Clayton Morrison. Colorado Mountain Development Company, operating illegal mining operation. Stop murdered federal officers. Jake Morrison, Caleb Wright. Stop evidence includes makeshift cemetery. 12 victims, personal effects. Federal badges, stop requesting. Immediate military intervention. Stop town under siege by armed mining company personnel. Stop." The message went out in short bursts, with Jimmy Chen working to maintain signal strength on the damaged line. Each click of the telegraph key felt like a lifeline being thrown across hundreds of miles of mountain territory. But before they could receive a reply, the building shook with the impact of something heavy hitting the front wall. Through the window, they could see Morrison's men had brought up a small cannon, the kind of artillery piece used in mining operations to break up rock formations. "They're not planning to burn us out," Boone realized. "They're planning to blow us up." The second cannon shot shattered the front windows and sent splinters of wood flying across the room. Jimmy Chen kept working at the telegraph key, desperately trying to maintain contact with the outside world as the building disintegrated around them. Then, miraculously, a reply began coming through. Territorial Marshal responds. "Stop federal troops dispatched from Fort Collins. Stop estimate arrival. Pine Ridge 4 hours. Stop hold position repeat. Hold position stop 4 hours." The message was both salvation and an impossible challenge. Pine Ridge had to survive 4 more hours against superior numbers, professional fighters, and artillery. The third cannon shot brought down part of the roof. And Tom Bradley made a decision that probably saved all their lives. "We've got to get this information to the defensive positions," he said, grabbing the written copy of the marshal's reply. "If our people know help is coming, they'll fight harder." They escaped through the back door, just as the fourth cannon shot collapsed the front wall of the telegraph office. But their message had gotten through, and somewhere to the east, Federal cavalry was riding hard toward Pine Ridge. The run from the telegraph office to the church, where Mayor Hawkins had established his command post, became a nightmare dash through a war zone. Morrison's men controlled most of the streets, and crossing open ground meant exposing themselves to rifle fire from multiple directions. But Banner and Sage had become more than guides. They'd become tactical assets. The dogs seemed to understand the danger, ranging ahead to identify safe routes and warning of hidden threats. When a sniper in the grain silo tried to draw a bead on the fleeing group, Sage's warning bark gave them time to dive for cover behind an overturned wagon. They reached the church as Mayor Hawkins was organizing a desperate sortie against Morrison's artillery position. The news that federal troops were en route transformed the defensive effort from a last stand into a calculated attempt to buy time. 4 hours, Mayor Hawkins repeated, checking his pocket watch. "We can hold for 4 hours." But even as he spoke, they could hear Morrison's voice across the battle zone, shouting orders to his men. The mining company leader had apparently decided that subtlety was no longer possible. Whatever happened in the next 4 hours, it would determine not just the fate of Pine Ridge, but the future of Morrison's entire operation. Through the church windows, they could see Morrison himself directing the assault, no longer hiding behind the pretense of legitimate business. His expensive coat was dirty with smoke and mud, his civilized facade stripped away to reveal the ruthless operator beneath. The final phase of the battle for Pine Ridge was about to begin, with everything hanging in the balance until help could arrive from the outside world. The sound of approaching cavalry reached Pine Ridge just as Morrison's men were preparing their final assault. The thunder of hoofbeats echoed off the mountain walls, growing louder with each passing moment until even the gunfire seemed to pause in anticipation. Boone, positioned at a church window with his rifle, was the first to spot them through his spyglass. A full company of federal cavalry riding hard down the main trail, their blue uniforms stark against the snow-covered landscape. At their head rode a tall officer whose bearing spoke of experience and authority. Colonel Marcus Henley, Tom Bradley identified, his voice filled with relief. Fought in the territorial wars. If anyone can handle Morrison's operation, it's him. The cavalry's arrival transformed the tactical situation instantly. Morrison's men, accustomed to operating without oversight or interference, suddenly found themselves facing trained military forces with legal authority to act. The siege of Pine Ridge became a federal crime scene, with Morrison and his associates now fugitives from territorial justice. But Morrison wasn't finished. From his position near the grain silos, he shouted orders to his remaining men, not to surrender, but to destroy the evidence of their illegal mining operation. Smoke began rising from the direction of the hidden camp, where his associates were burning documents and dismantling equipment. "He's trying to eliminate the proof," Mayor Hawkins realized. "If he can destroy the evidence and claim this was just a business dispute that got out of hand, not if I can help it," Boone interrupted, checking his ammunition. "That camp contains everything we need to prove Morrison's been murdering federal officers for months." The decision to pursue Morrison into the mountains while federal troops secured Pine Ridge was dangerous, but necessary. Too much evidence was being destroyed with each passing minute, and Morrison himself represented the key to unraveling the broader conspiracy Mrs. Patterson had warned them about. Tom Bradley insisted on joining the pursuit despite his injuries. "Those graves we found, I'm the only witness who can testify about what we saw up there. And Morrison knows it." They left Pine Ridge as Colonel Henley's troops were accepting the surrender of Morrison's remaining gunmen. Banner and Sage led them along the familiar trail toward the hidden valley, but the dogs' behavior had changed. Instead of the cautious alertness they'd shown before, both animals now moved with the focused intensity of creatures tracking wounded prey. "Morrison's hurt," Tom observed, noting the blood trail in the snow. "Looks like he caught a bullet during the fighting." The trail led them through the same mountain passes they'd traversed during their reconnaissance mission. But the landscape had been transformed by the recent violence. Morrison's retreat had been hasty and desperate, leaving behind equipment and supplies that told the story of an operation in complete collapse. They found Morrison in the same clearing where they'd first discovered evidence of his illegal mining activities. He was sitting against the granite outcrop where Tom Bradley's personal effects had been buried, his expensive coat torn and blood-stained, a revolver lying uselessly in the snow beside him. But he wasn't alone. Clayton Morrison had one final card to play, a leather satchel containing what appeared to be financial records and correspondence that could implicate his political supporters throughout Colorado. "Territory, Deputy Bradley," Morrison said, his voice still carrying traces of his earlier confidence despite his obviously weakening condition. "And the famous hermit of Pine Ridge, come to witness the end of the story." "Come to see justice done," Tom replied, his rifle trained on the wounded man. Morrison laughed bitterly. "Justice? You think this ends with my arrest?" The Colorado Mountain Development Company has investors from Denver to Washington. Politicians, railroad executives, territorial officials, men who won't let a profitable operation die just because a few mountain folk got in the way. But it was Boone who noticed what Morrison was really doing. While talking, the wounded man had been slowly reaching toward a stick of dynamite, probably intended for mining operations, but deadly enough to destroy both the remaining evidence and anyone close enough to testify about his crimes. The struggle that followed was brief but decisive. Morrison's injuries had weakened him, and Boone's years of mountain living had kept him strong and quick. When the dust settled, the dynamite lay safely in the snow, and Morrison's final, desperate gambit had failed. The leather satchel Morrison had been protecting contained exactly what Mrs. Patterson had suspected: financial records showing payments to territorial officials, correspondence with railroad executives, and documentation of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the boundaries of Pine Ridge. 3 weeks later, Boone Calder stood on his cabin porch, watching smoke rise from the chimney of a house he hadn't seen occupied in years. The Davies family had returned to their abandoned homestead, encouraged by news that the threats to Pine Ridge had been permanently eliminated. The territorial investigation, triggered by Morrison's arrest, had exposed corruption throughout Colorado's mining and railroad industries. Federal prosecutors were pursuing cases against dozens of officials, and new laws were being drafted to prevent similar conspiracies in other mountain communities. Tom Bradley had recovered fully from his injuries and received a commendation for his role in exposing the mining conspiracy. But more importantly for Pine Ridge, he'd been promoted to territorial marshal, ensuring that their community would have a strong advocate in territorial government for years to come. Sarah Chen had used the crisis to expand her business network throughout Colorado, establishing trade relationships that would benefit Pine Ridge long after the mining threat had been forgotten. Her courage in organizing the community's resistance had earned her unofficial recognition as the town's most influential citizen. Banner and Sage had found a permanent home with Boone, their loyalty and intelligence making them ideal companions for a man who'd learned that isolation wasn't the answer to grief or loss. The dogs seemed to understand that their role in saving Pine Ridge had created bonds that transcended the circumstances of their first meeting, but perhaps the most significant change was in Boone himself. The crisis had reminded him that community and solitude weren't mutually exclusive, that a man could choose when to engage with others without abandoning the peace he'd found in the mountains on quiet evenings. He still sat by his fireplace and thought about Martha, still felt the ache of her absence. But now those memories were balanced by newer connections to neighbors who'd proven their worth in crisis. to friends who valued his knowledge and experience, to a community that had learned the difference between privacy and isolation. The leather satchel that had documented Morrison's conspiracy now sat in a place of honor on Boone's mantle, not as a trophy of victory, but as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, like taking in 2 freezing dogs, can change the course of history. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, promising another long mountain winter. But inside the cabin, warmed by the fire and the quiet breathing of 2 loyal dogs, Boone Calder felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. He felt like he was home.